Truly striking, this gospel reading, recalling the passion of Christ. I hope that as we listen, that you and I were attentive and see ourselves in this gospel. One place in particular that I just want to draw your attention to is how there is this individual named Barabbas. And Barabbas was chosen, in a sense, to be released over Jesus. Pilate was ready to release Jesus, but the crowd insisted that to crucify Jesus and instead release Barabbas. There's that choice, in other words. There was the choice of Barabbas or Jesus, and the crowd chose Barabbas. Barabbas was a murderer. Barabbas was a rebellion. He was rebelling against the Roman state, the Roman Empire, fighting for the people for justice. And his route to justice was violence. He felt in his heart what was right, and in order to achieve what was right, he chose violence, he chose murder, he chose rebellion. Versus Jesus. Jesus also saw how Israel was enslaved indeed, but not so much enslaved by Rome, but enslaved by sin. And his path was not violence towards us or towards anyone, but his path was charity, love, forgiveness, reconciliation, care for the lowly and the humble. And so here are these two choices. The people did not choose Jesus, and they chose Barabbas. What does this mean for us? I think it's very significant because it is, in a sense, sort of like an analogy, a metaphor that we can look at and we can say how indeed our human condition, our humanity, our individual selves are so much like that. How many times, in other words, how many times in our life has we chosen violence over what Jesus was trying to promote? That we turn the other cheek. That if a person asks us to go 1 mile, that we go 2 miles. If they take our shirt, we give them our cloak as well. And in other words, that we give ourselves over in charity and love to those who persecute us, to love our enemies. Or do we choose violence like Barabbas? I think many times, and I just look at myself as well, you and I are in the same sort of situation, our human condition. How many times in your life and in my life have we chose violence over simple humility, gospel values? And maybe you might say to yourself that you're not a violent person. You never beat anyone. You never got in a fight, or you never hit anyone. That's good. But even though we might not be physically violent, we can be violent in other ways, can't we? The violence of gossip, the violence of tearing another person's reputation down, the violence of telling a lie, the violence of taking something that is not ours, the violence of the silent treatment. You know, sometimes we think of the silent treatment as just a way, it's not really violent, but I can't tell you how many times I've talked to couples, for example, but not just couples, that how they argue with each other. And sometimes it is terrible, the psychological violence that we can inflict on each other by giving each other the silent treatment. I think, for example, in prisons, how the worst kind of punishment that the prison gives an inmate is solitude confinement. To put an individual, isolate them by themselves and have them only to talk to their own selves. They don't have any interaction with anybody else, but maybe the guard, and that's it. And that does something to our psyche. So that when we put the silent treatment on other people, indeed it is kind of an isolation that we are doing towards them. And it is violent indeed. My point is, many times in our own life, we are like this gospel. We choose Barabbas rather than choosing the path that God has marked out for us in following Jesus to the cross. When someone slaps us, we would rather slap them back rather than just take it and turn the other cheek. So I bring this to our attention so that we might not hear this gospel and just think of it as something that happened so many years ago. It did happen many years ago, but it has a real meaning in our life, telling us something about ourselves and challenging us to turn our ways around, to convert, to change. This gospel is calling us to put away violence, put away Barabbas, and to choose Jesus. So as we enter into these next few days of Holy Week, I invite you, this gospel invites all of us to take seriously the cross, the call for us to take up our own cross and to follow Christ.